Where's that? Oh, dang it. Okay, sorry, that took me a little while longer to get started than it should have. This is going to be a quick little mini lecture on the controlling metaphor on first looking into Chapman's Homer. In a preview, here's the answer. Give the answer up front. Reading a poem is the same thing as traveling to a land. So that's the controlling metaphor there. Then you may ask, well, what is a controlling metaphor? What is a controlling metaphor? A controlling metaphor is a single metaphor that plays out over the entire poem, rather than being limited to a single line or stanza in the poem. So instead of having a metaphor like in one part of the poem, it's actually the whole poem you can see is kind of an extended elaboration of that one metaphor. Okay? Now, to get the answer to this, what is the controlling metaphor in this poem, let's take a look at the first stanza here. So what does it say? Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Okay? Now our answer here to this question of the controlling metaphor is going to be figuring out, first off, what does he mean by realms of gold? What does he mean by traveling in realms? He has traveled in realms of gold. What exactly is he talking about? And in this stanza, the clues that are going to get us this answer are the word kingdoms. So he's traveled in realms of gold. He's seen many goodly states and kingdoms. So these realms of gold are a kingdom. Some of them are kingdoms. Okay. And the other key word here, you've got another thing. So realms of gold, goodly states, kingdoms, Western islands, all the same kinds of things, all places he's traveled to. And you've got this bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Okay. Now we need to know that the word bards is a word for poetry, poets. So bards are poets. So Shakespeare gets called the bard, or the immortal bard. Homer is referred to as a bard. But the key word here is fealty. That's the one that's going to unlock everything for us. So we need to figure that word out. Okay, fealty. How does fealty work? This is actually related to the ancient political system called feudalism. And under feudalism, the king is the only person who owns land in the kingdom. No one else owns their land in the kingdom. The king owns the whole kingdom. It's all his land. A side note, there's a possible derivation of our term real estate from this, with real referring to the king, in Latin rex, and then to own real estate is to own the land outright the way a king would. So you own it, you don't rent it. Now how does feudalism work? The king owns all the land, but what he does, under feudalism, sort of centralized organization is not very strong. The infrastructure, they don't have a really great infrastructure system. And so you need to have sort of local management of the land, or the land needs to be utilized by local people. So what the king does is he loans the lord the use of the land. He loans a lord use of the land in exchange for loyalty, fealty to the king. So the king will loan this lord the land, and then the lord pledges fealty to the king. And that means taxes. He's got to pay taxes when he's asked. But most importantly, it means the Lord expresses his loyalty by calling up and leading soldiers when the king needs to fight. So anytime the king has a war or is threatened, the Lord is responsible for raising so many troops. A certain amount of troops is expected from him, depending on how big the land he's been loaned is, and the Lord will lead them and will fight for the king. Okay, so I got some pictures here that'll help us picture this. And then, okay, wait, not the pictures yet. Feudalism. So in Keats's poem, fealty refers to the kind of loyalty the lords had to the king in the feudal system. So that's what fealty there means it's referring to feudalism. Okay, so here's the pictures. Okay, so here's our kingdom, drawing of a possible kingdom, and the person who owns this whole thing is a king. King owns the whole thing. And so what the king does is he subdivides his land into various duchies, earldoms, counties, um, dukedoms, whatever you want to call them. Okay, so he subdivides it, and all these subdivisions he assigns to the various lords. Okay, they get to run the whole thing. Now, when you're the lord of this area, you're the absolute authority for the most part. I mean, depending on you're the leader of this whole thing. Everyone within your dukedom treats you as if you were the top authority. You can boss everyone around, and you get to collect, whatever tribute or whatever from the people underneath you. So you get, it's a franchise. You've got this franchise, and you can operate it for the most part how you see fit. It's just that you've got to kick some of your stuff, some of your money in taxes, sometimes up to the king, or definitely anytime the king needs military assistance, you have to provide that for him. Okay, so that's the political system. So in this metaphor, something is being equated with the feudal system. So something is the feudal system, and that something is poetry. Okay, now how exactly does that work? Well, one of the things you need to know is something that you could call the muse system. And the muse system is a way of thinking about poetry where all poetry comes from a muse. Now, nowadays, when they say muses in art, they tend to think of it's almost like a romantic relationship. Usually, it's a male artist type, poet, songwriter, something like that, and he has some female inspiration, and so like he's in love with her, he's wooing her, or something like that, and so he writes poems for her. She's his inspiration for his music, although it wouldn't necessarily have to be gendered like that. In the ancient world, though, the muse system was more of a religious kind of setup. And so with the ancient Greeks, you'd have Apollo, or whoever the god of poetry might be. There are different gods of poetry in different situations. Apollo is the supreme poet. So Apollo is not only the god of poetry, he is a poet. In fact, not only is he a poetry, but he makes or has made all poetry. So all poetry that has ever been or ever will be is made by Apollo. Okay, so just like the king owns all the land, Apollo owns all the poetry. Now, if an individual poet is loyal to Apollo, if he offers Apollo the proper votive offerings and things like that, Apollo will give him some poems. Okay, and if you think of this terms, our word inspiration works very much like this. So inspiration being what you could call the breathing in of the spirit. That's what it literally means. So Apollo breathes the poem into the poet. So Apollo inspires the poet, passes the poem from Apollo onto the poet. So, and we'll have some parallel pictures here to show us the metaphor. So you can think of all of poetry as one gigantic poem. So let's say this is a gigantic page that's somewhere out in the ether, and every poem that ever was or ever will be is written on this one gigantic page. Okay, and the poet who has written this page of all poems that ever were and all poems that ever will be is Apollo. So he's the poet that wrote this whole thing. But what Apollo does is, just like the king does with the kingdom, he divides the total poem, the poetry, all poems that ever was, into individual poems. Okay, he divides it up into individual poems. And then he assigns those individual poems to various poets. Okay, and so that's how an individual poet gets the poem, is through his loyalty to Apollo. So that the realms of gold, the goodly states and kingdoms, the western islands, all of those are lands, okay? But it's a metaphor that the land is the poem. So a poem is like a land, like a place, okay? And reading a poem is like traveling to a place, okay? And so that's what's established in the first 8 lines of the poem. The first 4 lines of the poem establish that metaphor. The second 4 lines of the poem apply it to Homer, okay, and then the last 6 lines of the poem show certain other similes, a couple similes that sort of spin off this, where you're excited discovering this new land the way an astronomer would be discovering a planet, or Cortez would be when he discovered the Pacific, except for the fact that it wasn't Cortez who discovered the Pacific, it was Balboa. But I'll talk more about that later.